So got a question today from Joe, who sent me a message asking, Chewy, what is your opinion on Judo versus Jiu-Jitsu? I don't think I've ever heard your view on this. Thanks, Joe. So he sent me a video to go along with it. So let's watch the video and I'll tell you my ideas, Joe.
Question today, what's the difference between Judo and BJJ?
The spelling are the two things. Listen, Judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are the same exact art. Want to have an argument or a discussion about the difference in the culture of the two, but I do want to say this. Even though Jigoro Kano came up with Judo, the terms Jiu-Jitsu and Judo were synonymous with each other until like the 1950s, all right? And then the terms kind of split. But when you look at the film and you look at the old school text, if you go to My Study of Judo by Koizumi, if you look at any text by Jigoro Kano, you'll see the De La Hiva, you'll see butterfly guard, you'll see the Kote Waza, the wrist locks, you'll see the Ashigarami, the leg locks. There is no move that is in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that is not in Judo. So there's always going to be evolutions in terms of movements, but the core moves of Judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are 100% absolutely the same. And to say that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not Judo is just disingenuous at this particular point.
So yeah, from my understanding, Rhadi Ferguson's 100% on the money in I think most respects, right? Because for the longest time, there was no difference between the idea of Judo and Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, Judo itself was sort of a combination of a couple styles of Jiu-Jitsu that were focused on, grappling. And then they sort of combine them together to make Judo. By the way, sort of Jiu-Jitsu as a whole is sort of like a blanket term for like martial arts, and there's lots of different styles of Jiu-Jitsu. But then Judo's, developed, and all the Judoka and Jiu-Jitsu guys are spreading this art around the world, doing challenge matches, fights, demonstrations, the whole thing. Some of them make their way to Brazil, and the Brazilians get a hold of it. And then they start practicing what they learned from these guys. But they're practicing that. And when you look at pre-World War II Judo, it looks far more similar to what we think of as grappling. There weren't as many restrictions. You had people attacking the legs with different throws. There was a lot more groundwork at times. There's some really good old school judoka guys where you would watch them and their groundwork is like really, really good. And again, at this time, the groundwork and the skills of these judoka are for the most part way beyond the Brazilian counterparts. And then there starts to be a split, right? Judo starts to go its own route and really solidifies itself as something unique. And from what I understand, the Brazilians really hang on to this, we're doing jiu-jitsu, we're not doing judo. Reading about Elio Gracie, this is one of the things that he really did. And it's like he basically had this style of jiu-jitsu that he was hanging on to. He's like, this is what we're doing. We're not doing judo. We're not giving into all this stuff. We're doing something very different than that. We're focused on this. This is our style. And even with the whole naming thing, for the longest time, Brazilian jiu-jitsu wasn't a thing. There was just jiu-jitsu. Like I talked to a bunch of older black belts that are, through my podcast. And when you listen to them talk, they said for the longest time, they never referred to it as Brazilian jiu-jitsu or Gracie jiu-jitsu. They're like, it's just jiu-jitsu. And then after UFC 1 comes out, hey, we need to market this thing as something. And so it's no longer jiu-jitsu, it's Gracie jiu-jitsu, it's Brazilian jiu-jitsu, it's very different. But for the longest time, there was no difference. It was just jiu-jitsu, to my understanding. But where you have the real splinter between these two is with the competition aspect of it, right? Because, when judo starts to become an Olympic sport and they start to put all these different restrictions on it, it changes. It changes the nature of how that art is expressed. Because if you start removing options, right? Like we can't grip this way, or we can't attack the legs, or we can't spend much time on the ground. And so it's going to change how that art is expressed. Think about freestyle wrestling versus Greco, or even folk style wrestling. You have these three different arts, and within them you'll see similarities, but because of the rules that there are placed on them, there's differences with how they're expressed. Like in freestyle, you're not going to see the level of groundwork that's used in, say, a folk style wrestling, where there is a big part of it is actually putting the person on the ground and riding them in positions and controlling them for a long period of time. Likewise, in Greco, you don't attack the legs. You're focused on upper body locks and throws and things like that. You see the same thing in freestyle. You'll see upper body locks, but again, you're also going to see a lot of shots to the leg. With Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as it starts to kind of come into its own with competition as you reach the 90s, that's when you really start to see this this divergent path. Was exposed to Vale Tudo for a while, so these no holds barred type fights. And so that was a big part of it. And then later on, when you have the creation of the IBJJF and some of these other events that have been around for a long time, IBJJF being the biggest one, you now have this sport element to it. And so again, it's expressed differently because of the competitive element that it was exposed to. When I first started doing jiu-jitsu back in the day, there was sort of the understanding that you were probably going to get into an MMA fight of some sort. And so we learned jiu-jitsu for that situation. Later on now, the IBJJF and the competition scene in general is so much more robust. There's so many more options for competitors where you have other elements or other things that you can get into besides just MMA fights. And so that changes how the art is expressed. And so I don't necessarily see them exactly as the same. I see them more of like brothers. We're very closely related. The DNA in us is shared and it's there, but the way that it was expressed is differently. And so that's how I see judo versus jiu-jitsu. They're really, really similar at their core. They're pretty much the same. As Rhadi Ferguson said, everything in judo at its core, and we see in jiu-jitsu, the big difference was how that art expressed itself with the competition settings that it got into. And if you guys are interested, there's some cool books to read if you haven't checked them out before. Robert Drysdale's written a few books on this stuff. Opening Close Guard, that's one of them. The Evolution of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's another good one. And his most recent one here that I've got is this one. This one was a fun one. This one's almost like he got all these different like files that were converted digitally, like all these old pictures and everything else from newspapers and stuff like that, but all kinds of really cool photos, and basically tells a story that he pretty much talks about here with a couple different ideas, but talks about it in here. Worth a read if you're a jiu-jitsu person and you want to know like the history and stuff. Really interesting, and leans on a lot of different sources to back up what he's saying. Because again, he got a lot of like backlash when he wrote those books because he kind of dispelled the myth of Elio Gracie being this like frail, sick little guy, which, for me, I was 18 years old when I first started doing jiu-jitsu, and I could look back at it and say, because I remember seeing the video of Elio when he went against Kimura, and Elio was he was a handsome looking dude. He looked healthy. He looked strong, right? I was like, this isn't the sick little frail old man that we were told, right? He was a fighter, and to me, honestly, I know some people get really angry about it, but I have more respect for Elio, like after reading about him and actually what he actually did, like the real version, or at least a more realistic version, because there's always multiple sides to the same story, but a more realistic version of this guy who was flawed, but also did this really powerful thing. Because again, if it wasn't for him, as we said, like we probably would have been gobbled up and became judo. We would not be this sort of esoteric jiu-jitsu style that we are now. But a couple interesting ideas to consider about this, right? About how our art expressed itself. And this is what Robert Drysdale talks about in these books. One of them is the back take, how powerful the back take was. Robert Drysdale says that that's one of the most important additions from jiu-jitsu to, like, say, modern MMA, is taking the back. We take the back like nobody's business. It's where we're trying to get to over and over again. Jiu-jitsu has really solid back takes. Also, we use the guard as a position that we could be offensive from. And that's really where, when you think about jiu-jitsu not being good for fighting in some cases, it's because the guard became a centerpiece for us, where we use it to fight against people, and it's not considered a bad situation. Because in most grappling arts, judo, wrestling, so forth, when you get pinned, like that's not a good thing. You lose or you lose points. But in jiu-jitsu, it's completely fine. And then when you think about jiu-jitsu, one of the other unique things that makes us say different from judo is this sort of hierarchy of position that we work through. So when we take someone down, if we take them down and land them flat on their back, that's not the end of our match. In judo, it may be the end of it. If we pin the person in wrestling or judo, that could be the end of it. But in jiu-jitsu, it's kind of the beginning. We take the person down, we get on the ground, and then we advance past their legs first. We're getting past guard. And then from guard, we then get to, side control, knee on belly, mount, back mount. We advance these positions where we would be able to deliver punishment through strikes, or more aptly be able to submit them, and the person's not able to attack us. That's kind of the idea. We get into these positions where we have an advantage to deliver damage through strikes and to stop them from being able to strike us. That, again, is a unique thing that we do in jiu-jitsu, and not to say that other grappling arts don't do it at all, but the way that we do it and the system that we have for it is practiced in our competition and is not practiced that same way in other sport competitions. Those are some of the differences and different ideas that I think of when I think of judo versus jiu-jitsu. Again, this is not an exhaustive video, but some ideas to chew on, Joe, and thank you for your question, bro. I'll talk to you guys next time.